Well, armed with a group of loyal Republican allies, President Trump is again trying to overturn the American voters' decision and stay in the White House despite losing the presidential election to President-elect Biden. Democrats are vehemently pushing back against these last-ditch efforts to challenge the state-certified results. So are some Republicans in and outside of Washington. Former House Speaker Paul Ryan said the move could do, quote, significant damage to American democracy. So let's bring in CBS News Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett to dig a little more into all of this. So, Major, for a while there after the election, when the president, began, even before the election, the president began talking about how the results would be fraudulent, we would sort of crane our necks to hear what other Republicans were saying, and we would often hear crickets. Now, it seems that there are certainly groups of Republicans lining up on both sides, both supporting the president and suggesting that he move on. We have, 11 senators now saying that they're willing to challenge the certification of the Electoral College votes. There are other Republicans warning, like you just heard, that this whole thing is doing serious damage to our democracy. What is the state of the Republican Party, and what is the state of democracy here in this country?
The Republican Party, Anne-Marie, is splitting apart before our very eyes. I don't know if that split will be continuous and pull the party completely apart, a traditional Republican Party remaining and a Trumpian-influenced personality party that splits away from it, but that's certainly possible. And it has happened, and it has become more visible in the last 4 to 5 days. And to your point, it's worth reminding ourselves that there were plenty of signs from President Trump before the election and immediately in its aftermath that he would fight this to the very end, even if that meant undermining the idea of what the Constitution says about states running elections, time, manner, and place. That's right from the Constitution. What the 12th Amendment says, what the Electoral Count Act says. And the president made it clear, and Republicans didn't believe that, didn't believe the worst about him. Well, now the worst about him is now manifest. In the tape with Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, the president could not be clearer. I want a specific number of votes. I want them found, I want them retabulated, and I want to win. He's done that in other ways, less direct, less forensically provable, in Pennsylvania and Michigan, meeting with legislatures there, calling them, doing the other things. So this is a systematic effort that for much of the time it was going on, Republicans on Capitol Hill said, well, the president has a right to pursue legal remedies, and I'm really not going to say anything beyond that, fearing retaliation from the president or Trump supporters. Well, that's now manifested to the place we are now, where there is now a body of Republicans so in thrall of President Trump and his supporters that they are saying Congress, for the first time in our history, should superimpose its will, its partisan will, over the votes cast and certified by swing states that President Trump lost. That's completely new territory. And when Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House, says it runs against the Constitution, it runs against federalism, and it will leave behind a sense that our basic measure of ourselves, which is our elections at the federal level, how we choose a president, are tarnished. That will tarnish that process. It will tarnish faith in that. That's what he means when he says this will do lasting damage to our democracy. So what plays out in this week ahead, Anne-Marie, will be extremely important in the history of our country, because there's going to be a dividing line. Which side are you on? Are you on the side of facts, the courts, and the Constitution? And if you're a Republican, federalism. Or are you on the side of a personality party dominated by Donald Trump, grievances, and conspiracy theories? And that's the dividing line. It's going to be quite bright. And everyone will stand on one side or the other, and I believe history will judge and judge accordingly.
To that recorded phone call between the president and the Secretary of State in Georgia, and you rightly point out that the president specifically says to him, I want to find, I think it's 11,000, it's roughly 12,000 votes. And he specifically says, Right. One more than what we need, he says. And yes, and throughout the conversation, he raises, areas of that he considers areas of concern. The Secretary of State, almost for point, says all of this stuff has been investigated already. Your data is incorrect, Mr. President. Of course, Democrats are very critical of this phone call, but some are even suggesting that what the president did there was a violation of the law. Could he be facing some legal consequences after he's out of office because of this phone call?
There are statutes in Georgia that make it a criminal offense to attempt to fraudulently change the outcome of an election or to either offer or use some form of intimidation against someone who's in a position to adjudicate an election. So, on the very face of it, that sounds like what the president was trying to do. Lots of legal experts in the intervening 12 to 16 hours have weighed in on this. Some say it's pretty clear that it's an attempted violation of the law. Others have said, sure looks like it, hard to prosecute because the president doesn't say things that are precisely prosecutable. You should do this, or I will do that, or here's an inducement to do this. So it may fall into a gray area. It doesn't fall into a gray area in terms of what is morally defensible, what is part of the essence of our approach to politics in our country, which is you want an election that is fair, that has been conducted properly and in accordance with the law, and if you lose, accepting it. That is the historic American way. Across parties, across decades, across most, if not all, of our history. And that's not what the president is doing. So he's not only unusual, he is dangerously unusual in this regard.
And of course, during that phone call, he points out that Georgia is heading into a runoff election. In-person voting is going to start in 24 hours or so. And he suggests that that Republicans won't want to vote because the election process has been such a mess in Georgia, according to the president. So yesterday, one of the Democratic candidates, Jon Ossoff, joined CBSN, and he explained just why he thinks that Republicans maintaining power in the Senate, and Mitch McConnell particularly maintaining power, is going to be bad for the country. I want to play some of that sound.
And he will block all of the progress that we must make over these next several years. He will block COVID relief. He'll block the necessary investments in the public health response. He'll block our efforts to reopen hospitals that have closed here in Georgia. He'll block the increase to the minimum wage. He'll block the investments in infrastructure and clean energy and job creation that we need. We have too much good work to do as a people to allow ourselves to be mired in years of partisan gridlock.
Okay, so it's what you expect to hear from him. I want to point out that we also, CBSN, did invite his opponent, incumbent Senator David Perdue, to be a guest on the stream. His campaign declined that invitation. But I want to ask you, how much is tomorrow's election in Georgia factoring into what we are seeing from congressional Republicans right now in Washington?
Well, let's do a case study. Ted Cruz is leading the effort to create a commission for a 10-day audit of the election. He knows that's going to go nowhere, but it's a procedural maneuver that makes it sound like as if he's on the president's side, even though he knows it's doomed to failure and it's not actually doable. You can't do a 10-day audit of 6 swing states, and there's no reason Congress should, considering what we know about this election. But it makes it look like he's on the president's side. He was in Georgia campaigning on behalf of the 2 Republicans you mentioned, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue. Said nothing about the commission, said nothing about challenging the election, said I'm laser focused on Georgia. So, on the one hand, he's trying to create a means by which to slow down the inevitable inauguration of Joe Biden and use Congress in a way it hasn't been used since the disputed election of 1876. We can get into that if you want to show his Trumpian bona fides. But in Georgia, when he's trying to talk to Republican voters, he doesn't say anything about that. He says, go out and vote and win this election for 2 Republicans. And that shows you, in a real-time way, the difficulty Republicans have. Continuing to gnaw on this desiccated bone of voter fraud in Georgia. Remember, ballots there have been counted not once, not twice, but 3 times, okay, with the same result all 3 times. Instead of chewing on that and gnawing on that, Ted Cruz says, no, Republicans, do your civic duty and vote Republicans in and win these 2 Senate seats. So that shows you how difficult it is for Republicans. They have to live in this world where, at one level, the President of the United States is saying the entire foundation of the way this election will be conducted is fraudulent, but go ahead and believe in it anyway. And if Republicans do lose it, it will be because President Trump has so muddied these waters and so conflicted Republican voters about what to believe in and how to translate that belief into votes or not votes. He's the factor that is most weighing on the re-election prospects of Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, and not in a positive way.
Listen, before I let you go, I've heard people say that, what we are seeing coming out of the White House, what we are seeing with, Republicans, some Republicans on Capitol Hill, this is the sort of stuff that happens in countries that do not have a firm hold on their democracy the way the U.S. does. I'm wondering if there will be any lasting implications sort of on the global stage when it comes to our allies or our foes as the Biden administration takes over.
Well, we know this. Our foes, and let's name them, Russia, China, Iran, and others, but Russia and China specifically, and no one more than Russia, loves to see Americans fight with one another about the very institutions that undergird our system of self-government. During the Cold War, Russians tried to sow those doubts and that animosity against Americans and between Americans with very little success. They've had much more success in the post-Cold War era. Social media has intensified that, weaponized that, and we have come to, for whatever set of reasons in our country, a point where we're willing to believe the worst about each other. And the longer we do that, the more situations like this, which is challenging an election that is the most transparent in American history, the most verified in American history. Remember, 95% of the ballots cast in this presidential election were paper ballots, which means they can't be hacked, they can't be changed, they are verified and have been verified. When you have an election like that, and you still see efforts to undermine confidence in that election, even when the courts have now had not 10, not 20, but more than 60 opportunities to review evidence, find all of it wanting, find all points of law irrelevant, and have upheld this election. After all of that, you still have efforts to undermine that election. Americans are going to continue to question each other and believe the worst about each other. And that's something that's going to be a residue of this process. That's why it's so important. This is not going to end this week. The grievances and the sense of dissatisfaction about this election among those Trump supporters will continue. How it will manifest, I'm not quite sure, but I believe it has begun to pull the Republican Party apart. And if Donald Trump continues to say all of these things and stoke all of these anxieties and grievances after he leaves the White House, I believe the future of the Republican Party, as we have come to know it, is very much in doubt.
Major, I believe your observations and analysis spot on. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.